Hello and welcome to an overview of Bethany's co-sponsorship program. Thank you for your interest in joining a co-sponsor team. You and your team have the opportunity to serve a vital role in the life of a newly arrived refugee or refugee family by walking alongside them as they begin a new life here in the United States. Bethany Christian Services is proud to have served refugees from around the globe since 1962. Today, the world is facing the largest refugee crisis in history, and it's growing larger and larger each day. This video will provide you with an overview of the Refugee Resettlement program here in the United States. We will define the word refugee, we'll discuss the global crises causing refugees to flee their homes, and we'll walk through the refugee process and discuss the Refugee Resettlement program here in the U.S. So first, let's define the word refugee. A refugee is an individual who flees their country of origin out of fear for their safety and is unwilling or unable to return to that country due to a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons such as race, religion, sex, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political affiliation. Now, the term refugee can be confusing because it's used differently in the media versus how it's defined under U.S. law. In particular, the term refugee is often confused with the term asylum seeker. An asylum seeker is someone who also flees their country of origin out of fear for their safety and is unwilling or unable to return to that country, again, due to a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, sex, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political affiliation, and they are now seeking asylum in the United States. Sound familiar? The definition is very similar, with one key difference. A refugee is given their legal status prior to arriving on U.S. soil. An asylum seeker is seeking protection and legal status after entering the United States. Now, around the world, there are many tragic situations which force people to flee their homes and communities. These include war, violence, persecution, global climate change, economic instability, and many more. One example I think of is the Syrian war, where millions of people have fled and 10 years later are still unable to return home out of fear for their lives. Another example is the ongoing economic crisis that's led to chronic food shortages and increased violence in Venezuela. Genocide, which is persecution based on ethnicity, is another reason for forced migration. I think of the Rwandan genocide, where members of the Hutu ethnic group targeted and murdered people of the Tutsi ethnicity. These global situations are intense and complex and heavy. It's important to remember that they involve the lives of real people, and they result in real trauma. So what happens after someone has been forced to flee their home country? The next step in the journey is to cross a physical border into another country or their neighboring country. Once in that country, displaced people tend to congregate in areas called refugee camps. These camps are not designed for people to stay for a long time. Many refugee camps are run by the UNHCR, which stands for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. This is the branch of the United Nations that helps refugees around the world. Once in the camp, refugees must register with the UNHCR to officially be documented as a refugee. And they're also given a ration card, which they use for food and other basic goods. Now, to reiterate, these host countries often aren't the sort of places where refugees can just find a new permanent home. The Syrian war has caused millions of people to flee into neighboring Turkey. The economic crisis in Venezuela caused millions of people to flee to Colombia. These countries don't have the infrastructure to support several million people entering their country at once. So what happens next? For refugees living in countries like these, there are really three main options. The first is to return home to their home country. But for most, this is not an immediate or even a possible solution. The second option is to stay where they are, but as we've discussed, that's not a good option for many refugees. And the final option is to be resettled in a third country, in a country where they can find a new permanent home. There are over 20 countries in the world that have refugee resettlement programs. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to focus on the US. The US currently has one of the world's largest resettlement programs. This program was standardized by the Refugee Act of 1980. And every year since then, the presidential administration sets the number for how many refugees can enter the US through the program. Over the years, numbers have fluctuated widely due to policy changes, politics, and overall numbers of displaced and vulnerable people around the world. So how do refugees get to the US? What's the process? It's important to note that refugees cannot apply for resettlement, but must be selected. In other words, they don't choose to come to the US. Their case is chosen. Once selected and chosen for potential resettlement to the US, refugees begin the process of moving through extensive biometric and biographical checks involving multiple government and international agencies. These checks include in-person interviews, background checks, and medical screenings. Finally, once these steps are complete, the refugee is given an interest-free loan to cover the costs of traveling to the United States, which must be paid back within 5 years. Once a refugee travels to the US, their case is given to what's called a National Resettlement Agency, who is contracted by the federal government to help them begin their new lives. These national resettlement agencies distribute cases to local resettlement agencies across the US. The local agency helps the refugees during the first few months, with the goal of helping them settle in a new home, adjust to their new communities, and begin the journey towards self-sufficiency. Services provided are quite extensive and include some of the following: securing housing, helping refugees apply for public benefits and Social Security, completing required home visits, visiting the local health department for a medical screening and updated vaccinations, and creating a plan to help the refugee become independent and self-sufficient as soon as possible. Bethany is one of these resettlement agencies, alongside dozens of other organizations from across the country. The refugee journey is harrowing and often long. I've met refugees who've lived in refugee camps for over 25 years before traveling to the US. The process of refugee resettlement is intense, stressful, and uncertain. It's traumatic. Regardless of background story, all refugees have been forced to leave their home, the place where they were comfortable, where they had friends and family close by. Moving to a new country is scary. For most, they don't speak the language, eat the same foods, they're separated from family and friends, and from their culture. And on top of all of that, they must provide for their families, or at the very least themselves. Once a refugee arrives in the US, it takes a lot of work and effort to become established. And that's where you and your co-sponsor team enter the picture. You'll help a refugee feel welcomed and supported as they heal from the trauma of their past and adjust to a new life and culture here. In this video series, you'll learn more about the roles and responsibilities of co-sponsor teams. So welcome. This is just the beginning.